Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming here during the lunch hour. I will not find it to be a rude gesture if you choose to eat during the lecture as well. It's more important to feed ourselves initially before we can begin thinking. So I appreciate everyone taking the time to come out and talk about what I believe is an important issue. In large part, as the introduction had expressed, that many of us ask questions about what's the good life, what's the proper way to live, and yet we live in many ways a scientific world. So a question that might show up is, to what extent might we look to science to think about how to live well itself? Science has certainly contributed to the field of medicine with our understanding of what it means to be healthy, but it doesn't really tell us what we should or should not do. So in many ways, this is what philosophy can offer. So in this talk, what I hope to do is provide you with somewhat of a sales pitch for the value of philosophy, to getting some insight as to how philosophy can help both science and the medical fields with regards to these more substantive issues of everyday living. So my approach in giving this talk will be to ask three central questions. First off, why think there's a relationship at all between philosophy, science, and medicine? My presumption is that most people don't even take philosophy courses or have the opportunity to do so until college. So in many ways, I think that the general public has, one, a misunderstanding of what philosophy is, and furthermore, secondly, what philosophy can do. And then I'll ask us to consider how philosophy can provide us with additional understandings of both science and medicine with regards to their particular projects, and then thinking about how we can approach science and medicine in a more ethical way. And so thinking about this ethics, this E word, typically we want to live ethically, but oftentimes we don't have the tools readily available to us to know exactly what that means. So in trying to think about why there might be a relationship between philosophy, science, and medicine, I think it's important to look to history. Look at the historical developments, in particular of science. So let's begin with a story. So let's go back to about 600 BCE in what is now presently Turkey. This is an area of Milesia. A group of thinkers known as the Ionians helped us get an understanding of the natural world. Their primary questions were, what are the fundamental substances from which everything can spring? At this time, the only thing that was available in many ways was just poetry and stories and myths to give these origin accounts. But yet, why should we think that these origin accounts are themselves true? How could you test them? What evidence do you have available for thinking that the gods have created everything? So instead of just appealing to poets, Thales began asking, what do I observe? Well, what I observe is I see that life seems to spring from moisture. When it rains, plants begin to sprout. When people engage in moisturous activities, life sprouts, reproduction occurs. So it seems that moisture is very important for our understanding of the origin of life itself. So why not then think that the fundamental substance of all things happens to be water? But this is purely just from observation. This is a different kind of method than what was readily available to the early Milesians to begin with. Anaximander thought more abstractly in thinking that, well, when life comes to sprout, it's structured. So it must have come from something that was itself not structured. He referred to this as the apeiron. Apeiron is best translated as the boundless. So things must first not be bound in order to become bound. So think about a book. Prior to the book being formed, literally being bound, you have loose pages and words, okay, in this boundless state. But this is again from observation, not from the poets of the time. Anaximenes followed up and asked, okay, well, where does moisture itself come from? It seems that we breathe. When we breathe, it can be warm. When air hits another object, it then forms condensation, which is itself moisture. So it seems that air has the capacity to produce water. So air might be a more primary substance to that of water, and we can then look to water to account for things like clouds, fire, and then as it becomes more condensed into things like stone and ice. But again, this is from observation, not from poetry. Pythagoras was a little bit more interested in the regularities, the patterns of nature, its cyclical nature, and thinking that we can look to in a mathematical way. So he thought that numbers, mathematical structures, were the basis of reality that allowed for patterns to arise that could be quantified. But keep note of these dates. These are 500 BCE, so quite a long time ago. We then have Heraclitus, who recognized that nothing remains in its constant state, but everything comes into and goes out of existence. So it's always in a state of constant change. He used the metaphor of fire as being the fundamental substance. He didn't literally think that everything was made up of fire, but instead that fire best represents this constant undergoing process or change. He referred to this as logos. So logos is this concept of the word or understanding that allows for us to then have structures that then we can then ascribe mathematics to. Aristotle, who I hope that many of you have heard of, used the same kind of what's called empirical method, this method of observation to come to acquire knowledge, and thought that there must be some fundamental substances such that we can identify particular categories or kinds, nature's joints, so to speak, to understand different species and so on. And Aristotle is thought to be the first biologist. So again, what we start seeing is that the early natural scientists, those who made observations about the world, were able to do so with this observational techniques to identify particular patterns, to then make claims about the regularities in nature itself, which inform much of what we know as the scientific process. Hippocrates, rather than looking to nature itself, looked to the body and saw how these patterns arose in similar ways. He then thought that to be healthy was to have a balance of what he called the four humors. Two of these are physiological and two of these are psychological. The physiological ones being blood and phlegm. So if you're producing blood outside of the body, you're probably not in a healthy state. Similarly, if you're producing a lot of phlegm, there seems to be an imbalance as well. So by keeping blood and phlegm in an appropriate balance, then you could be said to be healthy. Similarly, we have these psychological states represented by black bile and yellow bile, black bile being melancholic states, and yellow bile being anger, so choler itself, C-H-O-L-E-R. The idea there being that when our psychological states are also balanced, then we can be said to be healthy, which we now understand in terms of mental health. The Roman physician Galen, later on, worked in this Hippocratic tradition. We refer to it as a Hippocratic tradition and not just the writings of Hippocrates, because it's mostly Hippocrates' students who had produced the writings that we now have access to. And in thinking about what counts as a good physician, that physician must also be a philosopher. So we have these what are called natural philosophers informing our understanding of the natural world, and we also have physicians acknowledging the role that philosophy can have in assisting in understanding what it means to be a good practitioner. In large part, Galen thought that we need to focus on our philosophical skills when practicing medicine for three reasons. In large part, medicine had befallen particular problems. These problems are that doctors were only paying lip service to Hippocrates himself, not actually studying his writings, not being concerned with his ethics. Hippocrates' own oath came from Pythagoras, interestingly. The Hippocratic Oath is oftentimes still misunderstood. Typically, we think that it means, above all else, do no harm, yet that comes from the Geneva Convention and out of the Nuremberg Code, not the Hippocratic Oath. So that's a misunderstanding of classical Greek medicine. Furthermore, they lacked training in logical theory. So logic is one of the primary sub-branches of philosophy, and it helps us with having proper reasoning. So thinking that when you're running through the process of gaining evidence and making an inference with regards to a patient's capacity to be well in the future, that's going to require reasoning. Well, to understand how to properly reason, you have to be trained in logic. Furthermore, he recognized that many physicians of the time were being swayed by cultural values and not the ideals of medicine. So no longer were they essentially concerned with cultivating virtues for themselves of what it means to be a virtuous physician, but instead they were swayed by the cultural values of wealth. So rather than focusing on how to be a good practitioner, instead individual physicians were instead centrally concerned with obtaining fame and wealth. And if you read the original formulation of the Hippocratic Oath, those are directly at odds with the values that Hippocrates had set up for the medical field. So there's plenty of motivation for at least beginning to think that there's a relationship between philosophy, science, and medicine, in large part because philosophy was the source of all these things. Without philosophy, we wouldn't have science, and in many ways, without philosophy, we wouldn't have medicine. So when we recognize that the first scientists were themselves philosophers, we see particular benefits by looking directly at philosophy. We could look at some of the core fields, namely metaphysics, logic, and ethics. This is actually the Stoic approach to philosophy, asking the first question of what is reality actually like? What's the entity that you're looking at? What's the object? This is important for understanding the natural world and its particular systems, but also understanding the body. What is the body? What are its appropriate systems? What allows for it to flourish or to develop well? With logic, again, we can think about the patterns of proper reasoning, which argument forms or shapes are appropriate for applying to everyday cases, both including the body and the natural world. And then once we have those in place, we can then ask, well, what should we do about it? How should we live? So what's helpful is to think that with metaphysics, you come to know what exists, and logic helps you understand how to reason about it, but still they don't tell you if you should call your mother on her birthday. I don't quite get that answer just yet. So hopefully this is a good mapping of how philosophy can directly influence our understanding of both science and medicine. So it's helpful to read this chart. This is a column and these are the rows. So in the field of metaphysics, particularly a sub-branch of metaphysics known as ontology, which is the study of existence or being or things, we ask what sort of things actually exist. If you're trying to make a catalog of all the things that exist in the world, you would be doing ontology there. So how this applies to science, especially with the problem of unobservables, do those entities or objects that we cannot directly observe, such as quarks, do they actually exist? Or are they only theoretical postulates to allow our models to work? As this applies to medicine, we can ask, do diseases actually exist? So the ontology of disease. Is cancer actually its own entity? And also trying to understand what is health. Is health something that actually exists? Or is it something that we just have labeled for ourselves to find to be useful for our own personal endeavors? Is it only a pragmatic concept? So metaphysics is quite helpful in both science and medicine because science and medicine seem to be dealing with particular entities. By using these metaphysical tools, we can then develop a better understanding of those entities. With epistemology, we study knowledge. We ask ourselves questions such as, how do we come to know what we claim to know? What justifies our beliefs about what we claim to be part of our knowledge bank? So in science, we can ask, to what extent should we appeal to scientific evidence, especially when scientific theories have undergone periodic changes? So thinking about medieval science, which included things like alchemy, astrology, natural magic, which appealed to things like the ether. We no longer use that same framework, but that was the best science of the time. So why should we continue holding on to scientific evidence with the recognition that it's very well likely that our current scientific theories will turn out to be false? This is known as, this is a fancy phrase, as the pessimistic meta-induction. What it essentially says is that given the history of science being that all previous scientific theories have turned out to be false, why should we believe that our current scientific theory is the true one? We don't have very good evidence for that. I'm not saying give up on science, I'm just saying we have to reconcile that. Then in the case of medicine, it wasn't until very recent that we started engaging in what's called evidence-based medicine, with the development of statistics and collection of data. in order to figure out what will likely be the best treatments for an ailment. So we need to ask, from an epistemological perspective, what is the appropriate body of evidence for making a medical diagnosis? Typically, if you're dealing with a patient, you're going to be interviewing the patient with regards to what their symptoms are, their history. But to what extent should the patient be seen as reliable, especially when the patient isn't medically trained the majority of the time? So why would we use evidence that comes from something that's not medically literate to then make a medically informed decision? That's a big epistemological question. Also, try to think about what's going to work in one case may not work in another. We have concerns of axiology. Axiology is the study of values. There's two sub-branches of this, one being aesthetics, the other one being ethics. So aesthetics being concerned with the values of beauty and ugliness, and ethics being concerned with the values of rightness and wrongness, good and bad. So when applied to science, we can ask, what makes a theory elegant? That's something that we strive for in scientific fields, is to develop a theory that happens to be simple, understandable, has a particular mathematical elegance to it. You hear this language come up quite frequently by proponents of string theory, that they believe that string theory is the most elegant one out there and is the best candidate for developing a unified theory of everything. From a moral perspective, we can ask, how should we conduct scientific experiments? If something deals with a human test subject, should you ignore that altogether? And also, what sort of scientific projects should we fund, recognizing that there's a pragmatic, social, and financial component to our scientific endeavors? So the funding of NSF oftentimes comes from taxpayers. So we, in many ways, are taking on a cost for scientific, what we think is being scientific progress. So then in terms of medicine, we have this aesthetic view of why are we attracted to health and repulsed by disease? And then also, how should we treat test subjects in medical trials? So this led to the development of IBRs. Okay, so when recognizing that philosophy itself can offer quite a bit to both science and medicine, and seeing that there is the sub-branch of philosophy named as ethics, we need to ask, how should we actually approach both science and medicine in an ethical way? So I'll divide this into two sections, first thinking about the relationship between values and science itself, and then discuss ethical methods that can be developed and used. So those of you who are in my intro to ethics class, this will be review, but it's okay to review these things once in a while. So when looking at science, we have to first recognize two things. One, that it's human values that are informing scientific values. Science is something that's done by humans. Furthermore, given that science is something that's done by humans and that humans occur in a social circumstance, we have to recognize then that scientific endeavors are themselves social endeavors. So this then helps develop a set of values that humans take as being primary, but actually inform the scientific process itself. First thing they look for is generally consistency. Is their explanation for something going to be consistent with the best theory? We look for something called fecundity. Fecundity means the capacity to reproduce. So to what extent will the scientific theory or hypothesis result in other scientific developments? Accuracy. If you have a hypothesis that doesn't map onto the phenomenon that's being observed, then it should probably be dismissed or revised. We also have personal values showing up too. This is something that had shown up for Einstein in particular in the wake of quantum mechanics, when Einstein stated that God doesn't play with dice. He refused to think of nature itself as being up to chance. We also have aesthetic sensibilities that we do strive to have the most elegant or simple theory. We want theories or hypotheses that turn out to be successful with regards to predicting experiments in the future. The simplicity component is more of an epistemic constraint that we want to understand what these theories have to say. But simplicity is really just human understanding. If we can't understand our own theories, then to what extent can we actually use it for future scientific endeavors? And there's also a financial value too. That if something is going to cost way too much, then we're not inclined to pursue that. CERN is the exception, but in general, that most trials, when you're submitting a budget, it's not going to be funded if it costs too much. But this is also why we see so much science happening in the medical fields, especially with the development of pharmaceuticals. The financial payoff is so high that they're willing to take a lot of risks that they ordinarily wouldn't take if there weren't for those financial gains. So if we think about medicine in particular as an evidence-based scientific field, we need to ask further questions, and philosophers ask lots of questions, and that's why we're working through these. But think of these as analytic tools to dig deeper into the subject matter. We can ask, what is a central question for understanding how we should approach and what we should value in medicine? What this really means is, what is the aim or purpose of medicine? Is the purpose or aim of medicine to engage in only research? Or is it to actually cure patients? So if we pursue medicine only as a research field, we get statements like this. Those of you who can't read this in the back, this is from Saturday morning breakfast cereal. It says, a life tip: you can do pretty much anything if you yell the right phrase. As a person running around naked saying, "For science." Okay. Don't try this in the area. Okay, please. But Andrew Winter said, no, I'm not saying. Okay. Now, this is kind of a comical interpretation, but let's think about the real world importance of approaching medicine this way. We get the work of Sigmund Rascher. Those of you who don't know, he was the Nazi scientist who, because of his thinking that medicine is purely research-based, engaged in the twin experiments, in which he tied and bound twins to each other, burned them, so on, saying if you impacted one in one way, would that impact the other? Performed vivisections, which is to dissect someone while they're still alive. Engaged in bone, muscle, and nerve transplants, all without anesthesia. Head injury experiments on children in particular, so just tapping them on the head repeatedly until they go insane. Freezing experiments, so to see to what extent a person's body would start shutting down when exposed to cold temperatures. Malaria experiments, mustard gas, seawater sterilization, fertility, and high altitude experiments, all on unwilling test subjects. So violation of autonomy right there. That's what happens if we think that medicine is only research-based. So this seems to be a counterexample to the idea that medicine is only for research. So what tools can we develop to then assess a particular medical trial, medical experiment, such that those atrocities don't occur again? So from philosophy, particularly in the field of ethics, we get these tools of moral reasoning. We get a set of what are called normative theories. General normative theories are those that help us determine what we should or should not be doing. So such things that we get from there are an understanding of our obligations that comes out of what's called deontology, which is an understanding of our duties to one another, mostly formalized by Immanuel Kant, but a sense of how to respect other people's humanity itself, and that's going to inform our rights. Having a concern for the consequences. This comes out of consequentialism, so thinking about to what extent can we engage in an action that will promote the overall well-being of all those who are impacted, not just the individual. So weighing out the benefits and the harms and engaging in those actions that will promote more benefits than harms, while avoiding those actions that will result in more harms than good. Also getting a sense of moral principles, which actually come out of the normative theories. Things like beneficence, so that concern for promoting the well-being of others, as well as autonomy, which comes out of deontology itself. Autonomy is our capacity to govern and rule ourselves, our abilities to make our own decisions when we're mentally competent. And that's particularly important. An understanding of the rights that individuals will have just in virtue of being human. Something that comes out of deontology is this idea of the principle of humanity. Formally put, it's the second formulation of the categorical imperative. That's a little, heavy way of putting it, but the statement is that we should always act in a way such that you're treating someone as an end in themselves and not merely as a means. It's acknowledging that we can't help but use each other in a utility-like way, and we're using each other right now. But we're not going to stop there. We also have to recognize that each person has their own set of interests and their own life plan. So as long as you're acknowledging those features of that person, and when they're mentally competent and well-informed, allowing them autonomy, you're then upholding that principle of humanity itself. And then furthermore, learning how to reason by analogy, by thinking that if two cases are similar to each other in just the right way, that what you ended up doing in one case that was morally right, then you have good reasons for thinking that something similar should be done in the other case. And this is going to be a product of having proper logic. So when we have these tools in place, we can start asking moral questions. And so this is more of a theoretical constraint, and I'll provide more of a practical way of thinking about this in the next slide. So the first thing that you want to do is research. You want to gather information. You want to have an understanding of the situation that you're actually dealing with. Otherwise, why are you trying to act? You have no idea how it's going to impact the stakeholders. You then want to identify a moral question. Moral questions typically have the language of, is something right or wrong? Is something good or bad? What should I do? The word should is particularly important. Not just what can I do. It's more so just in terms of ability. But should imparts upon you this moral imperative. So if you can and should do something, then it would be wrong for you to not do it. Try to identify salient or clear answers. If you can't recognize the answers, then why would you be acting upon them to begin with? I think that so oftentimes when we're entering a moral dilemma of some kind, we end up just going along with hunches and intuitions, gut feelings, what our parents told us, what our culture allows and permits, what the law would permit, but we don't generally know why. So as soon as we ask that why question of what we should do and why we should do it, we can then ask ourselves, what is the actual answer to it? But having an answer isn't enough. You need to have good reasons for endorsing one answer over the other. So what we construct are arguments. Now, in philosophy, arguments are not just disagreements. It's going to be some claim that's supported by evidence. So if you have your salient answer of what you believe should be the response to that moral question, you then see which of those is going to have the best answer. So don't just cherry pick your evidence and think, well, this is what I want to do, and then I'll tell myself this is what I should do, so I'll find the best evidence for that. But instead, think, what are the alternatives, and then weigh out the arguments against each other. So one of the ways that you can do this is after you've constructed what you take to be the reasons in support of your position, is you also have to take into account counter-arguments, objections. Think that this is my claim, these are my reasons for thinking about this. What might be some reasons for thinking otherwise? And we need to entertain that because we don't want to just be right because it's our view. We want to be right, especially in a moral case, because it is the correct thing to pursue. So once we've done that, just imagine that you have two tables where you're comparing arguments and objections. You weigh them against each other. This is using a tool called reflective equilibrium, where you entertain a position, you consider the objections to it, and then you weigh them against each other. And that's going to help you to draw a final conclusion about what you should actually do. Now, this is very slow and methodical. And oftentimes when we're trying to make a moral decision, we have to do so immediately, especially in medical contexts. So that's why it's even more important to undergo ethical training. So in that way, this is just secondhand. That this is just how you actually think about the situation. So what might this look like in a more practical way is to first recognize the intuition that something seems to be wrong. And this is what I teach in my medical ethics classes, is that when you come across some situation, it appears that something might be problematic. But our intuitions themselves aren't entirely reliable. If we were to only use our intuitions for our understanding of nature, we would still be maintaining a geocentric world and thinking that it's the sun that goes around the earth, if we were to just stay at the intuition level. However, we recognize that intuition is fallible in other ways. Lack of perception, feelings get in the way, lack of caffeine, tired, whatever, emotional states might be arising. So we use other bodies of evidence that might turn out to be more reliable. So in thinking about the relationship between the earth and the sun, it's more likely the case that science is going to offer us insight than our intuitions. So we can't just stop at the level of intuition with moral issues either. What we have to do then is gather more information, ask questions, investigate, take measurements, get a sense of whether or not something is in fact wrong. In the medical context, this shows up where you might have a patient showing up to you and complaining about all these symptoms, but they might just be psychosomatic. When you actually gather information and take a look under the hood, so to speak, that you recognize, no, there's nothing really going on. It's just, you're having anxiety, you're stressed out, or you just really like to talk to me. And beyond that, there's nothing actually wrong with you. There's no problem. So gathering information is going to help to either confirm or disconfirm your intuition. If the intuition is disconfirmed, then you ask, okay, well, why did that seeming even show up, that intuition arise? If your intuition has been confirmed, then you go on and ask, what is actually the problem? In the same way when working with a patient, once you've gathered information and see that you've corroborated their own personal testimony about what they take to be their physical state, you then assess, okay, so what is actually going on? We do something similar in moral cases. We ask, what is actually the moral problem? What we do then is we look at principles and think which moral principles might be violated or which of them are coming into conflict with each other. So a classic example of principles coming into conflict with each other would be things like paternalism and autonomy. The idea of paternalism is that we should intervene on someone's choice if that person does not have the capacity to look out for their future well-being. This is something that we do on a very regular basis, even with our like helmet and seatbelt laws. We do this with children all the time. You don't have an understanding of what you're actually doing. So as a parent, I'm going to pull you away from that situation or help guide you into another direction. Whereas with the autonomy, that sometimes a person just can't make their own decision. They're not mentally competent. So if someone's inebriated, you exercise that paternalism to ensure that you're looking out for their future well-being, to ensure that they're not making decisions while inebriated that might prevent their capacity to be well in the future. You might also just have a violated principle. So beneficence might be violated, that whatever action is being pursued is just diminishing the well-being for all those who are impacted to begin with. Once you've identified either the principles that are conflicting with each other or being violated, you then know that you actually have a moral problem. So what we want to do is find a moral resolution. If the issue is a conflict between paternalism and autonomy, you need to come up with a resolution that resolves that particular tension. If beneficence is the thing that's being violated, you need to come up with a solution that then promotes beneficence. In a similar way to the medical field, when you're treating a patient for something, you don't do something entirely different. So if someone comes in with a broken arm, you're not going to treat their feet. I did my job. I treated you. No, you want to make sure that whatever resolution you come up with is fixing the problem. But we also have to keep track of the fact that we are always making decisions in a social context, that our decisions have the capacity to impact others, and furthermore, those who we're interacting with have the capacity to help us carry out that proposed resolution. This is very clear in the medical context. That's not just a patient who makes a decision. They might have a final say with regards to autonomy as to what kind of treatment plan they undergo, but how it's actually carried out is going to involve all the other stakeholders. By stakeholders, I mean those who have the capacity to make a decision or be impacted by the decision. So this is going to include members of the medical team, insurance companies, families, if it's a public health issue. So think about with the Ebola outbreak, that you might need to quarantine someone. Quarantining someone, you're definitely infringing upon their autonomy. But why are you doing that? For the well-being of the general community itself. Who's going to help you carry out that resolution? Very brave people. Okay? You can't just tell the patient, sorry, looks like you're ill. Can you go away for a month? In fact, there was a case in, I think it was Rhode Island or Maine, a volunteer nurse who had gone over to the first Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone, and she had refused to be quarantined. And she was out riding her bike and so on. And she's like, hey, look, I'm fine. I know what the symptoms are. The public health department said, look, you might be a risk to others. So sometimes law enforcement has to get involved. The point here, though, is that when you're trying to figure out what a resolution would be in either a medical or a moral case, you can't do it alone. We're social creatures, so we have to take into account the social factors that are going to allow for us to carry out the proposed resolution. So this is more of a practical way of just looking at real-world cases and then digging into the details to figure out the salient features, to then come up with a moral resolution of what you should do, and then identifying the action plan. How are you going to carry it out to fruition? So in line with these series on the Writer's Read program tied to the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, we can apply these particular tools, the stepwise method, in thinking about how to read it and come up with a potential resolution. We can also acknowledge the fact that this is a historical event, so we can't really do much about it, but we can ask what lessons might we be able to glean from this particular case such that we don't replicate those moral errors. So if you're not familiar with this book, my ethics class is actually reading this book as well. So hopefully this is helping them with their future assignments. But also, these are the actual cells. Now, what's so special about these cells is that they're the only kinds of cells that we've come across that have replicated nonstop. Quite frequently, cells, they can replicate for only so many cycles, and then they stop that process. These cells are still regenerating. So the case itself is being presented by Johns Hopkins. That's the institution that had initially treated her. And this is as it's being presented by the author of the book, Rebecca Skloot. So I'll just read this briefly. In 1951, a young mother of 5 named Henrietta Lacks visited the Johns Hopkins Hospital complaining of vaginal bleeding. Upon examination, renowned gynecologist Dr. Howard Jones discovered a large malignant tumor on her cervix. At the time, the Johns Hopkins Hospital was one of only a few hospitals to treat poor African Americans. To start thinking about poorness there, social justice type issues should be triggered. As medical records show, Mrs. Lacks began undergoing radium treatments for her cervical cancer. This was the best medical treatment available at the time for this terrible disease. A sample of her cancer cells retrieved during a biopsy were sent to Dr. George Gay's nearby tissue lab. For years, Dr. Gay, a prominent cancer and virus researcher, had been collecting cells from all patients who came to the Johns Hopkins Hospital with cervical cancer, but each sample quickly died in his lab. What he would soon discover was that Mrs. Lacks' cells were unlike any of the others he had ever seen. Where other cells would die, Mrs. Lacks' cells doubled every 20 to 24 hours. So from a research perspective, that's exciting. It's like a lot of things to play with there. Let me do this, see how this replicates. Today, these incredible cells, nicknamed Hela Cells, from the first 2 letters of her first and last names. Actually, most people working with Hela Cells had no idea about their source until very recently. Are used to study the effects of toxins, drugs, hormones, and viruses on the growth of cancer cells without experimenting on humans. So from a moral perspective, with regards to the test subjects, there's no concern about waiving rights or autonomy showing up. They have been used to test the effects of radiation and poisons, to study the human genome, to learn more about how viruses work, and played a crucial role in the development of the polio vaccine. So they've been paramount to our own well-being. Many of us here in this room are likely benefactors of her cells. But just try to think about, while reading that presentation of the case, what seems to be problematic, if there's anything, are there any moral issues that might show up? Now looking at this presentation of the case, her name was Henrietta Lacks. So focusing on the person, not the cells, not the research. But scientists know her as Hela. She was a poor black tobacco farmer. So more of her biography. Why was she in that situation? Why did she go to that hospital in Baltimore? Whose cells taken without her knowledge in 1951. So cells were taken without her given permission for her cells to be taken. This should prompt questions about to what extent we have ownership over our body, including cells, and became one of the most important tools in medicine, vital for developing the polio vaccine, cloning, gene mapping, in vitro fertilization, and more. Henrietta's cells have been bought and sold by the billions, so they've also contributed to industry. Yet she remains virtually unknown, So the lack of recognition. And her family can't afford health insurance. So it's important when reading this presentation how it's more evaluative. Whereas this is more about just descriptive fact, but morality is evaluative. You're evaluating things in terms of rightness and wrongness. It's part of axiology. This here is just trying to describe things from this empirical perspective of observation. So trying to think then about these social justice issues, is it fair that say one of your family members was to promote a particular industry but couldn't benefit from that industry itself, what rights an individual has? So starting to read off of those moral aspects and asking, would it be okay if we did this again? So that's reasoning by analogy and thinking, if it's wrong to do this in one case, would it still be wrong to do it in similar cases? And thinking about what we should have done in this case, might that be what we should do for future cases? Okay, so I still have time for questions and answers, but thank you for your attention. No questions, you're all resolved. Yes?
In regard to the cells, how did they finally find out who the cells belong to? How did that come about?
Just looking at patient records.
And do they know why her cells are so different and replicate?
Just the genetic makeup of them. That's a biology question, though.
Well, I just thought maybe since you had the research.
Oh, yeah, you know, I was just, more so just explaining that would.
Biology.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
So why was this not something that had been really researched or looked up about until recently? You said this was kind of more figured out recently.
Yeah, so Rebecca Skloot's book is really the first complete account. And as to why, I'm sure that we'll see something very similar in the future, that a lot of things that we should be aware of right now, we currently aren't. And
maybe that taking the focus off of the subject and onto the science facts and things. Maybe.
Yeah, so it's the research focus and not the patient focus. So we have this human tissue that does this really neat thing, but we're not necessarily concerned with that individual. So think about how oftentimes, say even the cadavers here on campus, it's not presented with a biography or anything, but yet the knowledge that you obtain when working on those cadavers is probably going to impact the rest of your life as well too. So this is something that happens quite frequently. But we also need to ask, what would happen if we allowed a biography to be attached to each individual? We might not be able to do our jobs as well in research. Might play on that emotional factor. I mean, so even in something like consuming animal proteins, that if you knew about that particular chicken, its life, where it lived, how many chicks it had, and so on, you might not be as inclined to continue consuming it. So we're affective creatures as well, and we have to recognize the fact that our emotions can influence our capacity to do good jobs. Good. Yes?
When did this case first come about?
Well, I mean, this is the 1950s when it occurred, but the book itself came out 2010.
Oh.
Yeah. 2010.
Any litigation?
Yeah.
It's still in process. Yes?
Was she told in any way that her cells were special before she passed? Like, did she have any knowledge, like, something crazy's going on with my body specifically?
Well, the people working in the labs didn't really know either. So these are details that are accounted for in the book, too, about how frequently she was coming back and researchers working on the cells. But given that she was working with a gynecologist predominantly and an oncologist, and someone was actually doing research on the cells, there's that disconnect then between those who are working on with the patient and those who are doing the research on the cells themselves. Yeah.
So you mentioned that the cells were taken without her knowledge, but didn't she know, wasn't she aware that a biopsy was taken and that a biopsy is basically cells from your body?
Good, so that ties into that autonomy issue, that oftentimes patients aren't medically literate enough to know what they're giving permission to.
So it was done without informed consent?
Precisely.
It was the 50s.
Yes, it was the 50s. And that's important. But also I think that we need to ask questions about what were we doing then that was wrong that we might still be doing? And ask, should we continue doing that given that we think that we shouldn't have been doing that in the 50s?
Well, I think in that time era too, people didn't really question their doctors. They just said, oh, this is what you need to do, go.
They were God.
Sadly to say, most people still don't question their doctors. Seeking out second opinions. This is something I teach in medical ethics and communicating that you have patient rights. That just because your doctor is telling you that this is what you need to do, that doesn't mean that's what you have to do. If anything, we should look to physician recommendations as just that, as a recommendation. Yeah, so in a lot of ways, this is an advocacy for patient rights. Yeah.
And do you think that the inclusion of philosophy tied with science and medicine, do you think that's increasing over the years, or do you think there's still kind of that illiteracy of people not knowing that philosophy is a big part in science and medicine?
No, I think that we still have a problem, and I think that the public's understanding of philosophy is in many ways almost getting worse. And we especially see this with even higher educational institutions getting rid of philosophy departments, getting rid of critical thinking requirements, and so on. Yeah.
What is about the topic 5G, the potential harmful effects on the frequencies of 5G, we as an autonomy human being without consent and exposed to those frequencies?
Yeah.
What is that topic?
That's something to be researched still. I know that. So in terms of what the impacts actually are, I don't know just yet. I know there's been
good research already in place.
Well, but there's also good research on the other side too right now. So it's that balancing out of theories of which one is actually giving the accurate explanation. Mm-hmm. This is why it's important also to look at the financial aspect of our scientific projects and asking who's funding this research. There's a great film called Thank You for Smoking that discusses the financial backing of various research teams by Big Tobacco to dissuade comments about there being a causal relation between smoking and cancer. So we still see this with, perhaps the cell phone industry too. I'm not trying to turn everyone into a conspiracy theorist. I'm just saying we need to reason through these things a little bit more carefully. Anything else? Well, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate sharing the space with you.
Thank you.